If you're a family caregiver and you're asking yourself, should I let my dad keep cooking if there's a chance he could forget to turn off the stove? Or is it okay if my mom insists on going for a walk alone, even if I'm worried she might get lost? Well, these are real questions, and there are rarely easy answers. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Hi, Dr. Lakelyn here. Welcome to Caregiver Chats. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an honor company. I'm so glad you're taking the time to listen. Be sure to subscribe to Caregiver Chats on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. I also love your questions. You can email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by dementia care expert Adria Thompson. She's the founder of Be Like Care, a speech-language pathologist, and is a leading voice in empowering caregivers with both practical knowledge and compassionate support. We're going to talk about something called dignity of risk. It's a term that originated in the disability rights movement and has since gained traction in senior living and dementia care communities. The idea is simple, but the application is complex. Dignity of risk means that every person, regardless of age or ability, has rights to take risks and make choices, even if there's some potential for harm. In the professional care setting, this philosophy often comes up when trying to balance a resident's autonomy with safety protocols in place at the community. But for family caregivers at home, the conversation looks different. Instead of liability concerns, families are often grappling with guilt, fear, and conflicting opinions about what is best. That's why I'm excited for today's conversation. Adria and I will be discussing what dignity of risk looks like in family caregiving and how caregivers can thoughtfully balance independence and safety, and what it means to truly honor a loved one's autonomy even as their dementia progresses. So let's dive in. Welcome, Adria. I'm so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Me too. And before we jump in, I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came into this field. You specialize in dementia care and communication and are such a wealth of information and knowledge. And you have an organization called Be Like Care. So we'd love for you to just share a little bit about that before we dive in.
Yeah. Thanks for your kind words. Yeah. I am a speech language pathologist. I have been for over a decade now. And my whole career has been spent in long-term care communities. So memory care, assisted living, and nursing homes. So I've done one-on-one speech therapy with hundreds of people living with dementia over the course of that time. I went into the field of speech language pathology because I actually had speech therapy myself as a child. And it just really fit with my strengths, my gifts. I like that more like personal one-on-one interactions, and I love the idea of being in the medical field. So that's kind of where I started. And over time, probably about 4 to 5 years into being a speech therapist in these settings, I started seeing that, I saw anybody who lived in these communities. So not just people with dementia, but I especially started noticing that my residents with dementia were the ones that were often overlooked. Like their needs were not always being met in a way that made me feel comfortable. They were often like the challenging residents, quote unquote. And my personality is just like, bring it on, like bring on the most challenging situations, like the most difficult, quote unquote, people. And so I kind of built a reputation for working with individuals with dementia. So I started training other therapists, speech, occupational, and physical therapists, in how to work with individuals with dementia and to kind of maximize compliance during therapy and maximize like the effectiveness of the kind of therapy that we're providing them. And so I created a dementia program for the company that I worked with. It's now used in like 14 states. And I really just grew such a passion and a heart for this community. And then around the same time, my grandmother was diagnosed with dementia. So it was a culmination of like both personally and professionally, I started seeing like, whoa, this world of dementia is so much bigger than I ever noticed. But also there's such a lack of support. There's a lack of resources, families, and even like professional caregivers in care communities are just left trying to figure things out the best they could. And so as a speech language pathologist, which my expertise is in communication in general and cognition, I started realizing I think that I play a big role here. Like, I think I can really make a difference. And so that's when I started Be Like Care in 2021 with the intention of training, like continuing to train in care communities and to prove my expertise, because a lot of people didn't understand what a speech therapist does for people with dementia. I started making videos on social media, and that was purely like an attempt to show other people that I knew what I was talking about. And by no means did I ever intend to become a dementia influencer. And I use that term ironically, but I just started building a community, tens of thousands of people who were like, can you make a video about this? Make a video about this. And so that's kind of what I'm known for now. That's my path into my specializing in dementia now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I always find it so interesting to hear people's career paths because we all, start out in our careers and we have no idea where it's going to take us. And so it's always so neat to hear how you've gone on to really create this community. And I've been a follower of yours for some time now. And it is so neat to see how you're bringing education in these kind of bite-sized chunks on these various topics that so many family caregivers, professionals are maybe challenged with or they're facing. And you simplify it and you make it really easy, digestible, but it also is so effective. So I'm glad that you're in this space, and I'm glad you're a dementia influencer, even though maybe you don't feel comfortable with that term. It's kind of a whole new kind of industry, isn't it?
Yeah,
the influencer world. Well, today we're talking about kind of this balance of independence and safety when it comes to working with older adults, individuals living with cognitive impairment. I know that there's this term dignity of risk that I personally have been doing some research into because I'm really fascinated by this concept. And it's talked a lot about in the care community setting, which I know you have vast background in, but not so much for family caregivers who are kind of living this reality every day, trying to figure out, okay, how do I balance my loved ones' independence, but also keep them safe at the same time? So I'm excited to dive in. Do you have any initial thoughts you want to share on this topic before we kind of get a little more specific?
Yeah, I got so excited when you kind of proposed the idea of talking about this phrase, dignity of risk, because I don't think it's talked about enough. And I think that there's so many gray areas about it that a lot of people aren't willing to kind of like dive into it. So I think maybe first define what that is. That's the speech therapist in me and the explain everything part of me. So let's start there. So dignity of risk, of course, dignity means like seeing a person's inherent worth and their value and being like respected as a person. That's dignity. And then, of course, risk is knowing that there's a possibility for harm or like some kind of undesired outcome. And so how do we like respect a person's worth by allowing them potential for harm? Like, that doesn't sound like it fits together. But I challenge listeners to consider, what are the kind of risks that you take in your life that are important to you for someone maybe not living with dementia, right? So we are constantly living our lives assessing risk and determining if the risks that we are considering are worth taking or not. So for example, I have seasonal allergies. So when I choose to go on a walk in my neighborhood, knowing that there's pollen covering every surface of my car and like everything, there's a risk that if I go outside and take that walk, that it's going to flare up my allergies. I'm going to be sneezing all night. But many days I consider, you know what? I know that there's that risk, but it's important to me. It is, I feel like life-giving to me to go outside, to get some fresh air and to see, have the sun on my skin. that is important to me. So I decide to take that risk. Also, gosh, riding in a car, walking across a parking lot, that's a risk, but we're often willing to take it because the destination is worth it to us.
Mm-hmm.
But for people who live with certain conditions, these risks might feel a little heavier. So if you're a type 1 diabetic, choosing to eat a second piece of birthday cake is going to be a risk to their health, and they have to determine if that risk is worth it.
Yeah.
Being able to make those choices, to do things, even though there might not be like safe for us, is part of being human, and it's part of living. And if someone were always to take away our option, even in moments when we choose to not take a risk, if we didn't even have that option, it would feel much different. And there are many times in our lives that we do choose to not take a risk. Like if you went out with your friends, you had one too many drinks, you're like, okay, I'm going to choose to not drive. That's a risk not worth taking because I could be injured and I could injure other people. And that's an appropriate decision. So the risks are different levels. They have different consequences. And so that's why, it's not super black and white as to what risk is worth taking and what's not. So when we apply this concept, not only to someone with dementia who might not have the mental capacity to think through all of these consequences and make a decision for themselves, but also taking into consideration that care partners are often the ones that have to make decisions on behalf of another human who doesn't always have the capacity to understand all the consequences. It just gets really, really muddy. So I guess to answer your question, my initial thoughts is that if this conversation feels challenging, it's because it is. But I still think it's worth having for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And I really appreciate how you described it and you gave so many examples of how this impacts us each and every day in our lives. And I think when we talk about dignity of risk in the caregiving setting, we're talking about like prudent risk. We're not talking about extreme risks. Really, a lot of times it's these mild, moderate categories of risk. It's nothing extreme, but they are challenging to navigate because of that such gray area that exists. So when caregivers are kind of thinking about this, maybe we could frame it in a couple caregiving scenarios. Yeah. If you have some examples of how maybe this dignity of risk shows up in a caregiving setting, I think that could be helpful as we continue on in the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that point that like a lot of the challenges that we experience in decision making when we're caring for someone with dementia, it's not always black and white because those risks are often not super severe. Like, if we're considering like, do we allow our dad with dementia and like Parkinsonism who physically has a difficult time to get around, should he use a chainsaw to cut down the tree in the front yard? That feels like an easy decision, right? Like the risk is very clear and it's like, okay, we don't have to have a conversation about that. That feels very obvious. But yeah, it is those more like mild, nuanced kind of things. So examples when you're caring for someone with dementia, it could just be like cooking. Like, should we allow access to the stove when we've never seen the person that we're caring for have difficulty with managing it, but we know they have a diagnosis of dementia and it could possibly one day get to that? Yeah. That's a gray area. Should we allow them to use knives in the kitchen to cut things? Should we allow them to attend a big social event like Christmas when we have 40 family members in a big loud room with lots of kids and dogs and rugs to trip over? Should they dress themselves if potentially they could wear clothes backwards and mismatched and inappropriate for the weather that day, right? So some of these things, it's like either the consequence is not exactly clear or we've not experienced that consequence in real time before. And so it gets a little difficult. So these are kind of the things. Do we allow them to go on a walk outside if not only could they get lost, but also could they trip over, a little bump in the sidewalk? These are challenging considerations because it absolutely has to do with the individual we're caring for and where they are and what kind of dementia they have.
I'm glad that you brought up the fact that, sometimes we're weighing these consequences for something that really hasn't even happened yet. My mom and I talk about this. We call it pre-suffering. Like a lot of times as a mom, I'm raising a little boy and I'm like thinking of all the things that could possibly go wrong. None of them have gone wrong yet. But I'm kind of thinking ahead. And I think that that's a good quality. It helps us stay alert and vigilant. But at the same time, if somebody is cooking and they're doing it successfully up until this point, maybe instead of just cutting them off from that, maybe we look for modifications to continue to make it safe for them. And I know we'll probably go into some more tips kind of like that, but I think sometimes we are in the caregiving world always trying to foresee anything that could negatively impact our loved one and then try to mitigate those risks. And so maybe after this conversation, we can get people thinking a little differently about that and maybe finding proactive ways to help continue to enhance that independence. And I love the examples you gave. And I actually was talking with a colleague of mine yesterday. Her family is struggling with grandma is still sewing. She's loved to sew, but she has cognitive impairment. And is it safe for her to still use a sewing machine? So again, another good example. And so I was, asking some questions. Well, has there been any injuries so far? Or I'm not a sewer, so I'm sure technology has advanced in the field. Maybe there's some safety mechanisms you can look into, or maybe it's time to start introducing like cross stitching, something a little with less machinery that's still in the sewing family that allows her to continue that passion. So that was a very relevant conversation that I just had the other day. So thought I would add that as yet one other example. But I think that kind of back to the caregiver and their processing of all of this risk and weighing the balances. When we were prepping for this, you had mentioned the guilt that sometimes is associated with this and the emotions. Caregivers, they don't want to feel like they're failing. If something does go wrong, they're the ones that are going to feel so guilty. And so perhaps that's where some of this really challenging decision-making kind of stems from. And so would love to hear your thoughts on kind of this caregiver guilt that is associated with this whole topic.
Yeah, that's a great question, because if we, for ourselves, if we decide to take a risk and it goes poorly, like we just blame ourselves. We're like, well, that was a bad decision. And next time I'll choose to do something different. But when we're making decisions on behalf of another human, it's not that easy to just be like, oh, well, like that was bad. You're going to feel guilt. So I think that, a lot of times when I consult with caregivers, I always tell them as a caregiver, you're always juggling three things: independence, safety, and the third we could describe as like joy or comfort, right? And so I imagine it's almost like juggling balls, right? Like you're constantly deciding in every situation, and we'll take the sewing machine, for example. Now, if we value a person's and we prioritize, I think maybe that's a better word. If we're prioritizing someone's independence, then we're going to be less concerned about safety and joy/comfort. And what I mean by that, if we're saying, okay, you know what? We want mom to continue to use her sewing machine because that's what makes her independent. And that is really, really important to her and her dignity and her personhood. And so we're going to push her to be as independent as possible. And so we're going to tell her, hey, you need to make me a dress. And I want you to try to do it on your own as much as possible. So we're not going to be as concerned with her safety. We're going to allow her to take some risks because independence is the goal here. And secondly, we're going to be like, hey, I know you're tired and I know you don't really want to, but this is important. We're going to push people out of their comfort zone if independence is our goal. And similarly, if we're valuing safety, prioritizing that over the other two, then we're going to say, you know what, mom, like the sewing machine is not really appropriate. So we are going to do some kind of cross stitch. I don't know these terms either because I'm not a crafty person, but yeah, we're going to offer you an alternative way to create something with things that are not so sharp and not so dangerous. And so that is, once again, not valuing her independence as much. We just want her to be safe. And we also don't care if she's mad about it, because we just want her to be safe, right? That's that joy that we're kind of putting to the side. And then if we just want her to be comfortable and happy, then we're going to say, you know what, Mom, do whatever you want. And we're not going to worry about independence. We're not going to push her to do more. And we're going to allow risk, because we're not going to be as concerned about her safety. And so we're always juggling these three things, and we can never prioritize all three of those equally at any given point. We're always trading off one for the other. Yeah. And so my advice for caregivers who are feeling like they're failing is that you need to have a conversation with the person you're caring for, if they're able to, and with the other care partners in your team, or even just with yourself, if you're solo, to say, in this moment in time, what is our priority for Mom? What's the priority? Is it joy? Is it safety? Is it independence? Because if we can kind of have a focus of what our care is for, then we can have more confidence when we're making decisions. We can say, okay, right now in this stage in life, often people in the more mild stages of dementia, it's easier to prioritize independence because we want them to keep doing the things that they've always done. And in the end stages of dementia, it's easier to prioritize joy and comfort because we're like, you know what, we just want them to feel good and be comfortable. And somewhere in the middle, typically, people will prioritize safety. But it's going to change over time. It might change day to day based on their situation. But if we can kind of target, like figure out what our target is for what's the goal, then we can have more confidence. And when bad things happen or when risks end up not turning out to be how we thought, we can say, well, you know what? I have valued their dignity and in this decision that I feel comfortable with. And that's just caregiving. And yeah, of course, it's never that easy to just be like, oh, I don't feel guilty anymore. But it does help to kind of have that process and to kind of figure out what your target is.
Adria, I love that you explain that in the terms of balancing those three things, the independence, the safety, and the joy or comfort. I think that is such a helpful framework. And again, we're never going to get it perfect. They're never all going to be equal at the same time. But I think just having that framework to help caregivers think through can maybe make some of this decision making just a little bit easier, or maybe helps them also kind of explain to others in that care circle. Often people are in a family unit, and we know family dynamics can sometimes be challenging. And, there's usually that primary caregiver who is the one that's having to make those decisions on, okay, should we prioritize the safety or the risks? And then sometimes there's other family members who are adding their criticism, or when something does happen, they want an explanation. And so maybe that can help families kind of frame the discussion in kind of those three buckets. But any advice to families who are trying to navigate this kind of in that family unit? Because we know that the caregiver guilt's already there. And then if you have the other family members jumping in, that can kind of add some fuel to the fire.
Yeah, great point, because that is often caregivers can feel those, especially those like primary caregivers can feel confident in the decisions that they make. But brothers and sisters, cousins and kids and friends, they might not agree. And so I think, open conversations are incredibly important. And I encourage any listener who might have someone in their life who are in the very beginning stages of dementia, or even just in the aging process in general, to have a really frank discussion and take notes, audio record it for future reference, but just talk through that kind of framework. What's important to you for yourself? Because if we're just making decisions on what we think could be helpful or what we think that person would have wanted, it's so much more difficult to have those conversations with other people and kind of bring them alongside of you and agree to these situations than if we had, okay, you know what? In 2022, I had a conversation with Mom, and I wrote down what she said, and she said that she doesn't care about her safety as much. She wants to be comfortable, and she wants to always take her walks, and she wants to, whatever that looks like. She wants to use her sewing machine until, even if it means she sews her fingers together, like that's important to her. So it's hard. It is really hard. But I think my biggest advice for caregivers or care partners in general is to know that guilt, the presence of guilt, is not an indication of a right or a wrong decision. So rarely in caregiving are there clear right and wrong choices, right? We're always just like doing the best we can.
Yeah.
But a lot of times when caregivers feel guilt about something, they take that as an indication that they made the wrong decision. And that is absolutely, absolutely untrue. Guilt, unfortunately, exists in caregiving regardless, even when you make great choices out of love and out of education and understanding and deep compassion for a person. Guilt can still exist. So it is the presence or absence of guilt is not an indication that your decisions are either right or wrong. So don't let that be your guiding light, of having guilt-free caregiving, because unfortunately that's just not the case. And I think friends and family need to hear that too. Just because you feel guilty that a person's life is changing in certain ways, that doesn't mean that something is wrong.
Gosh, I think that is such a key piece of advice for caregivers, because you're right. When I talk with caregivers, they always have kind of that feeling of guilt. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad caregiver because you feel guilty. It probably actually means you're a good caregiver because you're having to weigh these decisions. You're making the best decisions possible in the moment. And I was watching a webinar on this topic. It was framed up kind of in the falls category, which is probably a whole nother podcast episode on falls alone and the risk you do or do not want to take. But, sometimes even when you have set the person up for as much success as possible, you have all the safety devices, you're even in the room with them, they could maybe still fall. And that is really hard to accept. And that's, situations where, I wish I coulda, woulda, shouldas come in, and the guilt. And so I think it is important for caregivers to give themselves that grace in their caregiving, because no one is perfect. No caregiver is perfect, but we're all, as you mentioned, just, doing the best we can with the situation and the information we have, at our fingertips. And I loved, again, that framework you shared earlier. In addition to that, Adria, what would be some additional maybe tips for caregivers as they're kind of going about their day-to-day caregiving role, where they can help foster independence in the person that they're caring for? Yeah,
great question. And I'm really glad you brought up that, that falls can still happen. Like you can have your hands on a person and they could still fall.
Right.
And in long-term care communities, I've often heard the phrase like the resident has a right to fall. And that sounds like, so uncomfortable, but it's true. And I don't think that those kinds of things are told to personal caregivers at home as much as it should be, is that like the person you're caring for has a right to have, to have risk, but also to fail, to fall, to cut themselves, to whatever that looks like. Of course, we never want it to happen. And I think a lot of times when we talk about like risk and, knowing that these things can happen, it starts to fall into the category of like, oh, well, then is that neglect? That's a really tough word, because we can still love someone, support them, be present for them, and bad things can happen. So bad things happening is not always a sign of neglect or abuse or anything like that. So some tips. I encourage care partners to kind of find like the middle ground, the good balance of supporting a person enough to where they're not frustrated and that they experience success, while also not over helping them to where they get annoyed and they check out. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And many caregivers, especially caregivers at home, have the urge to say things like, No, mom, just sit right there. Like, don't worry about it. Just stay there. I'll take care of it. And we think that over helping them, that doing everything for them is love. And in many ways, it is detrimental to the person that we're caring for. You've heard the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? That is certainly true as far as like physical functioning, but also cognitive functioning. So we don't allow people with dementia opportunities to physically and mentally feel some challenges, then they'll lose the capacity much quicker. And so some tips there is like, if, yes, you choose and you decide that using the oven or using the stove is too dangerous, and that is absolutely an appropriate decision to make in a lot of cases. But that doesn't mean that just because they can't cook independently anymore, that doesn't mean that they can't assist in the process at all. Yeah. So what we do is maybe we take them away from the stove, but we have them cut up vegetables or pick out the spices from the drawer. We give them a list of things that spices we need, and we have them find them, right? Some of these things where we can decrease the cognitive and physical complexity of tasks while it allows them to still participate on a smaller scale, but still they feel purpose. We're still honoring their dignity and their participation in a task that they love. And we could talk for the next 3 hours about examples of how we can apply that to every task in life: showering, brushing our teeth, going on a walk, all of those things. But basically, it's like how we provide enough support so that they can be successful in some way, but we're not over helping them to where they just sit back and say, well, never mind.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what's important to keep in mind is that balance will change over time, and it could change day to day too, depending on where someone's at in their journey of dementia or whatever disease that or chronic condition that they're facing. And so that is kind of that sweet spot is a moving target at times, which can maybe be frustrating. But I like how you phrased it. Like, if you can tell they're getting frustrated, maybe that's when you step in and offer a little bit of support. But on the other side, if you can tell that they're getting annoyed, maybe you back off a little and let them do it themselves. So that's like a kind of great checks and balance for caregivers as they kind of, again, navigate this complexity. And any other kind of maybe safety tips that maybe we could help caregivers think through when they're building out maybe their daily routines, or any other tips that you'd like to share? I know, as you mentioned, we could talk about this for 3 hours and go through all of the different care examples, but would love maybe just a couple more if you have time.
Yeah. So if there's a listener that's like, okay, I do feel like I'm over helping, or maybe I'm not supporting enough. I do want to help figure out that middle ground a little bit better, but that feels so overwhelming to do that for every task for your entire life. I encourage you to pick 15 minutes of your day, or maybe even just like one daily task. So maybe just when your dad is sitting down to eat and you've seen that he's having difficulty feeding himself, so you just are feeding him completely, like hand feeding him. There is a lot of space in between someone independently feeding themselves and you just stepping in and fully feeding them. There's a lot of middle ground there where you can provide some support without fully taking over. So I encourage care partners to think about what is either a 15-minute part of your day or one task that you can say, this week, I'm going to trial and error some tips, some different ways of supporting them. Because if you're trying to do it all day long, it's going to be overwhelming. And as you build confidence yourself in figuring out how to handle that task or those 15 minutes, then you can start expanding it into more parts of your day. So some general tips would be to break a task down into smaller steps. Yeah. So you might be saying for brushing teeth, hey, Dad, go in there, grab your toothbrush and brush your teeth. And he's not able to do it. Okay. Well, maybe the next step is just breaking it down, even verbally, into smaller steps. Dad, pick up your toothbrush. Okay, grab the toothpaste. right? So we allow time for processing and then for them to follow through with that task. And then we give them step-by-step instructions. So it's breaking things down into smaller steps. Also, maybe modifying the environment a little bit. So often people will have difficulty in showering, and we'll see that they are using products inappropriately, right? They have like lotion in their hair, and they are using, shaving cream for their face or something to wash their face. So what we can do is to simplify the environment. If you look in your shower, how many bottles are in there? So many times there are like 6 or 7 bottles, not only for that person, but for other people in the family. So take everything out. And when they get in the shower, you hand them 1 bottle at a time and you tell them what to do with it, right? So simplifying their choices, figuring out what bottle is for what thing. Also, using some adaptive equipment, using grab bars or a modified utensil, a heavier, bigger gripped utensil, those kind of things can be helpful. And offering choices, right? So if you say, what do you want to eat? And they can't answer that question, then say, pick 2 things that are actually options for this situation. Do you want meatloaf or spaghetti? That's honoring their dignity, allowing them some independence to make choices. But I know that figuring out how to do that is really difficult, and the experts in this world are rehabilitation therapists, physical, occupational, and speech language pathologists like myself. So if you're finding that there are a lot of tasks in your day that are super challenging, I recommend that you ask the primary doctor, especially for an occupational therapist referral, but maybe referral for all 3 therapies, because we can come in even into your home and walk alongside you and say, here's how you can find the sweet spot. And here, let me do these modifications for you and model them for you. It's an incredible help that a lot of caregivers don't utilize. They don't know to utilize.
Yeah. Well, I love that you shared that as a resource, because that was going to be one of my next questions is what kind of resources can we share with caregivers to help them along kind of this journey of balancing safety and independence. And I agree with you. OTs, PTs, speech pathologists, language pathologists, they are such great resources. And so tapping into those individuals can be so helpful. And I do love that, as you mentioned, they can come into your environment, which makes them even more effective because they're seeing you in your day-to-day setting, helping you adjust. And I think many caregivers will say, wow, that made more of a difference than I could have ever anticipated. So highly encourage that. Any other resources, Adria? I know your website, your social media channels, those in themselves are great resources. So would love for you to share about those and then any others that you find helpful that you refer often to family caregivers.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, so I have large social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok mostly. Also a little bit on LinkedIn, where I have over 500 videos that are 90 seconds or less.
Wow.
And they're all about practical tips for care and helping you understand what's going on in the brain of your loved one. And so all these examples that I've given, I think every single one of them I've made a video about in some capacity, and many more of how to modify things, how to support people, and things that we might need to think through when we're caring for someone with dementia. So those are all available for free on social media, and you can scroll for endlessly for hours if you wanted to. I also really recommend caregiver support groups for helping figure out how to manage some of these situations and when risks are helpful, when to modify your decision making, that risks are starting to be dangerous for other people. Caregiver support groups are a great place to talk through a lot of those things. The Alzheimer's Association is a good resource at large, even for other types of dementia, to help figure out what local support groups, like in-person even support groups, might exist in your community. There's also a lot of virtual support groups through the Alzheimer's Association. But if you're caring for someone with a specific kind of dementia, maybe young onset dementia, which is dementia before the age of 65, if you are 40 and you're caring for your husband with dementia, you're going to experience a lot, and you have children, you're going to have a lot of different challenges than someone who is caring for their spouse when they're 87, right?
Right.
So you need a space that's going to be where you meet where you see your people and that people really get it. And a good example for young onset dementia support would be Lorenzo's house.
Yes, they're fantastic.
They are amazing. They have a lot of virtual support, not only for spouses of people with young onset, but for children. They have fantastic resources for children, anywhere from like 5 to like 35. So they're a fantastic resource. Also, Hilarity for Charity, HFC. They have great virtual support groups, and especially some more niche ones like just for men or things like that. So virtually, there's lots of opportunities. But if you prefer that local kind of in-person touch, the Alzheimer's Association or your local area agency on aging might be able to give you some resources and how to be in a room with people who get it. That is so incredibly important.
Gosh, it's so powerful because we know isolation and loneliness impacts caregivers, and it's and not only is that that feeling of isolation, but when you connect with a community, that's when I see caregivers open to all of these resources that we've been talking about, and it just helps make their caregiving journey a little lighter. I won't say easier, but when you're connected to resources and you're connected to others that get it, get what you're going through. I've heard caregivers say, gosh, wish I would have joined the support group, years ago, or started all of this research years ago. So if you're listening, hopefully this is your clue to plug into some of these great resources that Adria has mentioned. And we'll include links to everything, of course, in the show notes. And Adria, I just want to thank you so much for being willing to dive into kind of somewhat of an uncharted territory in terms of this topic. I'm so glad we're starting the conversation or continuing this conversation. It's so important, but I think it's also, important to acknowledge there's still so much of that gray area. We have not figured it all out today, but you have provided some great tools and resources. And as we wrap up, Adria, any parting thoughts or final things you want people to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to remember that we're taking care of adults, and these adults have lived full lives. They've experienced so many incredible moments, really challenging things. They have their own, perhaps they have other medical conditions, other mental health issues. They might have traumas in their past. They might have triumphs and successes and things that really bring them joy. And so that's why the dementia caregiving experience is so challenging, because it's not one size fits all. Not only are each and every one of these humans who are diagnosed with dementia unique, but every type of dementia is so unique. And so, yes, there's so much that we can glean from other people who have walked down this road and from people like me who share tips. But you are an expert in the person you're caring for, and you are their best advocate. And don't forget, maybe you might describe who they were, but also I would challenge you to consider that it's still who they are. Yeah. And so that dignity of risk, this whole conversation is about just valuing that person and realizing that you're not always going to get it right, that safety is not always the pinnacle of caregiving. It's okay to allow some space if it feels good, if it feels right for you and the person you're caring for, because it's a part of being human. But on behalf of the person that you're caring for, I just want to say, even if you haven't heard it from their lips in a while or maybe ever, I want to say thank you. Thank you for thinking through these things, for taking time to consider what's best for them, for listening to podcasts about caregiving. All of these things tell me that you are the perfect person for this job. You're in the space you're supposed to be, even if you didn't choose to be here. And we appreciate you. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Oh, gosh, Adria, I echo that thanks and amplify it by 1,000, because I don't think caregivers hear the words thank you enough for what they do. And so And thank you, Adria, for being here and for sharing. I have enjoyed this conversation thoroughly and hope we get another chance to talk for those 3 hours about all of those other examples and continue this conversation again sometime down the road.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is fantastic. And we'll have to get it in our calendars for all the conversations that are needed in this space.
Absolutely. A sincere thank you to Adria Thompson for sharing her wisdom with us today. This conversation is such a powerful reminder that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach in caregiving, and that's okay. To our listeners, if you've been feeling overwhelmed by the tension between independence and safety, I hope this episode leaves you with a little more clarity and compassion for yourself. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other caregivers. You can email me also with your questions at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. That's caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Our handle is @homeinsteadinc. There you'll find caregiving tips, episode updates, and so much more. Thanks for listening, and as always, please take good care of yourself as you care for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, please visit homeinstead.com to learn more.